It's been several weeks since Indian and Chinese troops have confronted one another in a remote pass through the Himalayan peaks. Since then, hundreds of troops from both sides have been locked in a standoff a few dozen meters apart. In the meantime, nationalist rhetoric has been flying fast. The standoff has aggravated the already tense relations and is considered the most intense crisis between the Asian powers in the last 3 decades. However, what is less clear are the geopolitical motives behind the standoff. My name is Shirvan and welcome to Caspian Report. China and India share a border of roughly 3,300 kilometers in length, much of which hasn't been demarcated, and so from time to time there have been frictions. But this time, the situation is slightly more complicated. The current stalemate isn't even a dispute between Beijing and New Delhi, rather it stems from a discord between China and Bhutan. The incident started on June 16th when a group of Chinese military engineers began construction work in the Doklam area, which is one of the 7 disputed territories between Bhutan and China. Beijing had been operating freely in the Doklam territory since 2005, and the work appeared to be an effort to extend a road closer to India's border through the Dokla Plateau. In response, on June 18th, Indian military forces crossed Bhutan's border and barricaded the Chinese project. As a counter-response, authorities in Beijing deployed their own forces to meet the Indian army. Although the details of the security situation are unclear, most sources believe that roughly 400 soldiers on both sides have been locked in a stalemate near the Dokla Plateau. The region of contention revolves around the tree boundary area of Doklam, which is the point at which India, China, and Bhutan meet. However, the borderline between China and India has long been settled, so the current standoff concerns the border between Bhutan and China, which has never been demarcated. Officials in Bhutan claim that the tree boundary point is situated about 4 kilometers north of the Dokla Plateau, where the standoff between Indian and Chinese troops is ongoing. Meanwhile, China claims that the point sits near Mount Hipmochi, at roughly 2.5 kilometers south of the Dokla Pass. Since 1984, officials in both countries have tried to resolve the dispute and have held 24 rounds of diplomatic talks. Nevertheless, the protracted nature of the negotiations indicates a major disagreement, and Chinese officials blame India for it. In this framework, it's noteworthy to mention that in 1949, India and Bhutan signed the Treaty of Friendship, which gives the former significant influence over the latter's foreign policy. The treaty was revised in 2007 and gave Bhutan greater autonomy, but it retained that neither government shall allow the use of its territory for activities harmful to the national security and interest of the other. Essentially, due to the treaty, China and Bhutan have no formal relations. Moreover, it's also the reason why the crossing of Indian troops into Bhutan is not a violation of international law. The details of the Bhutanese-Chinese dispute are slightly obscure, but the disagreement lies in the interpretation of the Calcutta Convention of 1890 between British India and the Qing dynasty. The agreement confirms China's territorial claims to Mount Hipmochu, some 2.5 kilometers south of the Dokla Plateau. In this regard, Beijing sees the Bhutanese-Chinese borderline already determined by the Calcutta Convention. However, in historical relation, in the 19th and 20th century, Himalayan border delimitations were based on the basis of the highest mountain ridgeline. In the disputed area, the ridgeline runs from the tree border of China, India, and Nepal to the area of the current standoff. However, topographically, the ridgeline ends at the point which India and Bhutan claim as the tree boundary point, which is some 4 kilometers north of the Dokla Plateau. So even though the convention clearly mentions China's claim over Mount Hipmochu and thus reaffirms Beijing's position, it's equally important to mention that the document contains a topographic error, which is likely the result of poor survey work in the 19th century. But as interesting as topography and centuries-old treaties may be, the governments in New Delhi and Beijing merely use these technicalities to adjust the narrative to their design. The true nature of the conflict is geopolitical. What makes Mount Hipmochu so essential is its relationship to the surrounding environment. For instance, a Chinese road through the Dokla Plateau towards the Hipmochi mountain, and by extension an observation post, would give a clear view of the local area. The mountain sits near the Jamperi Ridge, which descends into the foothills of Bhutan and then leads to the Siliguri corridor. This corridor is the primary supply line that physically connects India to its northeastern territories. At its narrowest point, the Siliguri corridor is measured at 27 kilometers and thus forms a strategic choke point and a core vulnerability of India. The capture or blockade of the Siliguri corridor would detach northeast India, which is home to about 45 million people, from the rest of the country. To that end, whoever controls northeast India controls the upstream riparian of the Brahmaputra River, which flows through Bangladesh and drains into the Indian Ocean. Thus, in the Doklam region, the further south China manages to push, the more leverage it gains in South Asia and the Indian Ocean, and the more Beijing can shape New Delhi's behavior. On the other hand, the more Bhutan can push north, the more secure India gets. For this reason, India seeks to claim territory on behalf of Bhutan with the ultimate goal of securing its own interests. Now, relations between China and India have never been good, but in recent years it has declined sharply because of the former's support for Pakistan. Beijing sees its relationship with Islamabad as a means to contain India from becoming a regional contender. In this context, Beijing's construction of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, as well as many other economic projects of the Belt and Road Initiative, runs counter to Indian interests. Besides the grand scheme of things, China has repeatedly undermined India's diplomatic efforts. For instance, Beijing has used its UN veto power to deny India from imposing sanctions on Pakistani militant figures and from keeping New Delhi from entering the Nuclear Supplier Group, which denies India access to modern nuclear technology. India, in the meantime, returned the favor by, among other things, boycotting the inauguration of the Belt and Road Initiative. Although both countries are roughly the same in terms of population size, China's military, economic, and diplomatic resources outstrip that of India. For this reason, India cannot afford a military skirmish with China. As such, Prime Minister Modi has sought to reach a diplomatic resolution to the standoff and has asked China to return to the status quo before the incident. However, since China outperforms India, the Chinese leadership is confident in its ability to come out on top, which is why Beijing has given an ultimatum that diplomacy can only be possible after New Delhi unilaterally withdraws its troops. At the backdrop of the crisis, the Kingdom of Bhutan has been left in an awkward position. Siding with New Delhi would invite retaliation from Beijing, while distancing itself from India would cost Bhutan more than it would gain with China. Ultimately, though, despite the exchange of nationalist rhetoric, neither China nor India wants to initiate hostilities, especially since neither side has the means to immediately exploit a military victory. More precisely, Modi is busy reforming the economy and the government, while Xi doesn't want the infrastructure projects of the Belt and Road Initiatives to come off as an act of Chinese hegemony. That being said, considering the strategic value of the region, neither the populist government of Modi nor the authoritarian rule of Xi can afford to concede, especially since India will hold general elections in 2019, while in China the ruling party will convene in November for the 19th National Congress of the Communist Party. In short, both governments have positioned themselves in ways that will make a retreat very difficult. Therefore, the new state of affairs is such that the anticipation of war is unlikely, but so is the prospect of a swift diplomatic settlement. What this means is that the standoff in Doklam is set to continue with no end in sight. This was a Caspian Report by me, Shirvan. Special thanks to our contributors on Patreon who give us the means to continue our independent research. Now, if you're searching for additional sources on geopolitics, check out Visual Politic. It's a channel that addresses the recent political and economic events. Their videos range from startups in Estonia to immigration in Japan to the rise of Chinese multinational companies. It is a channel that provides meaningful content, so if you enjoy Caspian Report, I highly recommend subscribing to Visual Politic as well. In any case, thank you for your time and Sarol.